And I don't want you to think like everyone was so impressed. Oh, everyone wanted it. Everyone was so impressed. Because the reality is that a lot of the general feeling was that Judaism, and not just Judaism, but the Christians now I'm jumping into the book of Acts, that Christianity was a boring religion with people who were either snobs or they were socially detached. Okay? You know why? Because they only had one God. And they didn't go to parties or orgies. They didn't celebrate that way. They didn't eat everything and just for the sake of it. They still, even if you're in the church, you weren't eating food that was animals that was strangled. You know, you remember how James and the apostles, they said, okay, listen, let's do this. They went into fornication. They didn't go to the temples and try to attain spirituality through all these other sorts of ways. They were kind of like boring people, and they didn't like them. But something about their way of life with Christianity, with God, was very attractive. Not only that, signs and wonders were happening like crazy. They thought it was just like crazy. Here's something else. Their God seemed to love people because he made their religion known and knowable and not secret. A lot of secret religions and stuff going on. It's not a secret. Okay? So it was big. So the diaspora, the Jews were everywhere, and they'd been Hellenized. Okay? So all of this area, it's like, what is Greek thinking? Greek language, Greek education. The Jewish, Latin, okay, doesn't have theological vocabulary like Greek does. But Greek possesses philosophical language, philosophical vocabulary, theological vocabulary. So if the whole world now can read that and understand that, it's a major step up from Latin, which didn't have that. So now you can talk about God and spiritual truths and in a language that people can understand. It was big. Oh, sorry. The synagogues were all over the place. They became the meeting place for the Jews and like a representation of Judaism, so to speak. I think it's a pretty good model for like a church gathering as well. They would come together, they would read scripture, they would worship, there would be teaching and lessons. Okay? And it'd be a gathering place, and especially after AD 70, that was very soon after the writing of Acts. But in that time, and there were also forced diasporas and persecutions going on, you couldn't go to the temple anymore. Especially out in the outside world. After AD 70, the temple was destroyed. That's why I said that. But way out there, if you were a Jew and you couldn't go to the temple, then you couldn't be a part of that sacrifice. But with Christianity, they came to the Jews. They explained it's been fulfilled. The law has been fulfilled. You don't have to go to the temple. Okay, because the Messiah is here. So there were gatherings all over the world already. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. We already talked about this, right? We must have a peaceful kingdom. No riots, no uproars. Everything was about maintaining order. Not because it's some sort of utopian society, as the Romans kind of thought they were. It was about maintaining control and peace. You see this a lot in the book of Acts. And this is why, and even in the Gospels, it's very convincing that it was a religious issue and they connived against Jesus to get him killed. Right? He didn't do anything wrong. It's a peaceful religion. And the kingdom is spiritual. It's not trying to overtake Rome. Okay? Theophilus, you can relax. Romans, you can relax. We're not trying to take over Rome, or we're not trying to build a political kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom for everyone, whether you're a citizen of Rome or not. Roads were everywhere. We talked about this already. People could move much faster. Shipping, economics, it was all happening. Currency, you could move around. Women's issues. Women weren't really held in too high regard in actually Judaism or Greek culture, Roman culture. It was a little bit better for Jewish women in some ways and otherwise, but the women were generally a lower class. You got to remember this. This is why in Acts and in Luke as well, but in Acts, when you start seeing women being named as a disciple. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha. She was always doing good and helping the poor. That's a massive statement. The word disciple actually carries identity. Okay? We're almost done here. Caesars, they posed a problem. They had ultimate authority and they demanded worship. You had to worship Caesar. If you didn't worship Caesar, you were against Rome. This is a big problem. You could decide not to worship the other gods. That was kind of up to you which gods you picked and choose. But if you would not bow to Caesar, this became a massive problem. And some Caesars more than others. Nero was a good example of that. What else do we have here? Claudius wasn't that good either. He's before that. But that was a big deal. Persecution and temple destruction. Persecution was happening all around the place. And then eventually the temple was destroyed. Okay, now when the temple was destroyed, the interesting thing there was, now this is in AD 70, so this is just after we think Acts was written, but it was leading up to that. The synagogue was the only place to worship after the temple was destroyed, but because of the persecution, that was dangerous as well. As far as for the Jews went, if you towed the line with the Romans, you're okay. Yes, mate.
Why are they being persecuted if they're like a peaceful religion? If they were, being seen as a peaceful religion?
Why were they persecuted if it was a peaceful religion? Because they wouldn't bow to Caesar. Because the Jews were constantly trying to get the Christians in trouble by saying it is a bad religion coming in and creating all sorts of problems. If you remember the temple at Artemis, Paul's preaching it up so well that people go and they start burning all their books and getting rid of the idols, and that was major economic overthrow. That was major economy that was being disrupted. People didn't like the way of life being disrupted, so they started making trouble for them. And they started preaching the persecution came like that. And why are we persecuted in places around the world? We are being persecuted. The persecution is coming big time, by the way, to the church in this century. Right? Now, in our country, it'll look like various things, but it will come through education, government, immigration, education, IRS. It's going to become harder and harder and harder to maintain our way of life and not being forced to accommodate other ways of living and thinking because we're Christians. It's going to be very real, not to mention physical stuff. That's a very quick answer to that. And so I think with that in mind, I'll leave you with this. Luke is leading up to Acts, and Acts, this is a geographic presentation of that. But I want you to think like this, and then we'll take a break, right? Here's a little picture. Think of the dating. Now, this is when dating is not really a thing to really, it's not a hill to die on, but I just want you to see this. This is where Jesus comes, okay? So let's say that's 0, let's say 33 or whatever you want to put there, right? Okay? And let's say this is 90, somewhere 90. John is written out here somewhere. Acts, let's call this, right in the middle would be 60. Acts is written around here somewhere. And it's actually talking about a lot of this life in here. Right? All the way back to here, okay? Because it starts at around the ascension of Jesus and Pentecost. Luke is written before it, and that covers, it talks about here, right? But this is the time frame that Luke and Acts is written. So this has taken place, but this as well. Jesus is gone. So they've been living for the last 30 years without Jesus on earth with them, but under the power of the Holy Spirit. And Luke knows this when he's writing Luke, and he's building on that when he gets into Acts. Matthew, traditional scholarship says, was written in here somewhere. And Mark up here, kind of from the voice of Peter around this time in here, kind of same. So they are living in an early Christian church Roman world while they're being written. But they're looking back at this stuff in here. Okay. Now, if you think Mark is the source, then this can come a little bit earlier, and Matthew can come out here somewhere else. But it doesn't make that much difference when we're looking at going into Acts itself. You got to realize when you're looking at Mark and Luke and this stuff, they're already living under the Roman rule as an early church. So what are they saying to the people? Why are they writing it to the Jews? Why are they writing it to persecuted Christians? Why are they writing the gospel to Theophilus, and what's it saying? And now Acts comes in after all of this, right in this time here, and stuff is about to get crazy. That's why we know it doesn't talk about Paul's death. It hasn't happened yet, which is around 64, they think, right in the height of the Neronian persecution. It doesn't talk about Peter's death, same sort of time. But that is the time frame this is all happening. Okay? So it's not like all of a sudden Luke starts writing in AD 33. He's writing 30 years later, talking about, and this is how it happened. Okay? Understanding this is how we think. So he's not talking about the internet yet because it hasn't come yet, right? But towards the end of Acts, he might have said something like, and around that time, internet was invented, right? So he's looking back. This is the way it happened and who we are. But I know you understand IT language if I have to throw it in there. That's a point of a poor analogy, but that's the thinking behind it because he's writing to Theophilus. And he probably is assuming, I would say probably it's safe to assume he thinks it's going to get distributed. Because I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe some Randy or Angie or you guys, the SBS grads, and Andrew, maybe you know, you can talk to them later about it. Is Theophilus part of a gathering of believers somewhere? So maybe he's writing it to him. And you got to also understand that Peter and Paul are major players when Luke is writing this, and they're in trouble. They're about to be in trouble. Paul's already in trouble. So this is why and Danny can get into this next week. I think it's next week, right? That the last 8 chapters or something of the book of Acts, like 25% or something of the book, is all about Paul's defense. And this is when Luke is writing it to Theophilus. Let's take a break. Who's leading today?